Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was born before the Nine Tails attacked. Really, how much can small things affect the world? Little things like the color of someone's hair? Their mentor? Maybe, their date of birth? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 33, Familiar Encounters. Naruto gazed up in mild confusion, locking eyes with the caramel-skinned girl above him who simply stared right back, an uneasy silence settling over the claustrophobic patch of forest. It was as though the animals themselves could feel the tension in the air and had wisely evacuated. Both shinobi were tensed, their muscles coiled in anticipation for whatever the other would do. However, after it became evident neither were ready to attack, Fia frowned. "I'm sorry about this, Naruto." Taking no other cues, she suddenly darted forward, exploding off the branch with a blast of concentrated air. It was obviously a slightly more extreme version of her light step technique that Naruto had already witnessed firsthand. Her body span through the air like a drill as four translucent wings unfurled from her spine, rapidly buzzing to life and speeding her forward in the same instant. She impacted with the earth with a catastrophic boom, sending dust and dirt sailing over the canopy and into the air. "Sorry about what?" came Naruto's reply, not exactly from the position Fia had expected. All she held in her hands was earth. Naruto was across from her, sitting up in a tree. His expression was cool and his tone was even, his eyebrow merely raising an inch as he looked down at her, their positions suddenly inverted in the blink of an eye. The verdette scowled, her now solid orange eyes narrowing as her body suddenly contracted, crouching into the ground like a tightly coiled spring before releasing with another blast of wind. This time, keeping her Biju-enhanced eyes trained on the redhead, she managed to spot it, not that she could do a damn thing about it. At the very last moment, as her hands were poised to close around his throat, his hand twitched and released something into the air. However, by the time she realized just what it was, he had already vanished in a flash of crimson. He appeared within a millisecond though, right behind her. With a strangled cry, her eyes opened wide as she suddenly felt a strong grip on two of her wings. In the next moment she was spinning, and not in the way she wanted to. It was as though her shoulder blades were attempting to escape from her back. The pain was intense but brief, as not a second later Naruto released her, sending her into an uncontrollable dive that had her skidding along the ground like some child skimming stone. As she picked herself up from the shallow trench she had gouged with her body though, it was a scowl of annoyance on her face, not of pain. "You held back." She coughed out, cracking her neck as she got back to her feet. "Not much the worse for wear. You could have sent me right into the ground, I might have even been knocked out." She growled in annoyance. If there was one thing she truly hated with every fiber of her being, it was being taken lightly, being looked down on. "It might have also broken your neck." Naruto responded easily, hopping down to the ground with his expression calm and collected. His posture might have lulled lesser shinobi into believing he was open and unprepared, but Fia wasn't fooled. However, in the next moment he surprised her by actually lowering his guard, a saddened frown pulling at his features. "I don't want to kill you, Fia." It had the opposite effect than intended though. Instead of matching his softened expression, Fia's scowl only grew more intense. "Don't look down on me." The ground around her seemed to shudder as a vile wave of what could only be described as pure anger washed over the immediate area. The kunoichi's entire body was enveloped by a coat of sickly orange energy that writhed and twitched as though it had a mind of its own. Her previously crisp and defined wings grew frayed and indistinct, gaining the same hue as her eyes instead of her hair. Her scowl twisted into something far more malicious as two antennae-like protrusions of chakra grew from her forehead. "Phew, think about what you are doing," Naruto warned slowly, his muscles slowly tensing as Fia hunched over, obviously fighting to control this new wave of power. "Don't let this thing dash." However, without a word of warning, Fia suddenly vanished from view, the ground behind her suddenly buckling under some unseen pressure. In the same instant Naruto leaned back, catching himself with his hands on the ground as a massive scythe of orange-tinted wind screamed overhead. It was as though time had slowed down for a second and Naruto was able to look right up into Fia's eyes. However, there was little of the girl he had known in those solid orange orbs. Time snapped back into motion and suddenly both were a whirlwind of movement. Fia's attacks were relentless. What her wings had lost in finesse they had gained in pure power. Naruto found himself almost overwhelmed as she pushed the offensive. Every movement, every kick, every attack was pushed forward by those wings, giving them tremendous power and speed. There was no escaping them either. Feints seemed useless with those antennae on her head. It was though she wasn't so much seeing him as she was feeling where he was in relation to her. There was little he could do about it as well, at least right now. Attacking would have been foolish when she was in this state. While his blows might have been enough to wind her in this form, the cost would be too high. He knew all too well how volatile and poisonous that chakra could be. If he was touched, then he shouldn't have been expecting the use of that limb for the rest of the fight, and that was if it didn't just kill him. So for now he dodged, using deft motions to stay just outside of the Berserk Kunoichi's range. It couldn't last though, and both of them knew it. For however evasive Naruto may have appeared, for how much it looked as though he were on the back foot, the redhead's mind was always working, always thinking ahead the next few steps. His eyes darted craftily about as he began to throw kunai about the clearing. In her enraged state, Fu didn't even notice the subtle movements. When his net was complete, Naruto gave the Biju-possessed girl a sly wink before vanishing. The moment she realized her prey had disappeared, Fu let out a tremendous roar. It was an unsettling sound that seemed crossed between the staccato buzz of an insect and the growl of a predator. The surrounding forestry shook from the sheer force it exerted, however it got her no closer to locating her suddenly missing opponent. The question didn't remain unanswered long though, as suddenly Naruto was in front of her again, a look of intense focus on his face as he suddenly grabbed her by the shirt. This time there was no pause, no slowed moment shared between the redhead and the berserker. Naruto simply grabbed her and immediately threw her up with a grunt of effort, a moment later popping out of existence and revealing himself to be a shadow clone. However, Fu's short flight didn't end there, as not even a moment later another clone was in front of her, inexplicably appearing in a blight flash before performing a similar maneuver. He span as he grabbed her, using the sudden rotation to throw her further up at the cost of his own existence. This repeated countless times for Fu in a dizzying, disorienting display of flashing acrobatics, always from different directions and always too fast for her to react to until she was far above the canopy. It was only then that she finally noticed the kunai hanging in the air above her, just completing its arc before falling back toward the ground. Before it did though, a final Naruto, the real one this time, suddenly teleported into existence, a firm grasp on the hilt of the blade. In a seemingly impossible feat of human flexibility, and with momentum retained from a previous jump, he suddenly twisted his body, simultaneously curling and unfurling his body before lashing out with a tremendously fast axe kick right to Fu's stomach. For a single agonizingly long second, the verdette's entire body curled around his sandaled foot before she was sent flying back down toward the earth. A low sonic boom drowned out the enormous crash her form made upon impacting the ground, a visible ring of displaced air rushing outward. Of course that wasn't enough to keep a Jinchuriki down, or even a truly seasoned Jonin, and after a few moments with her head ringing, Fu was able to drag herself out of the sizable crater Naruto had decided to dig with her body. Of course, that was all simply the distraction. A Hyratian seal she hadn't noticed Naruto plant on her stomach glowed faintly as the redhead appeared in front of her, a frown marring his features. "I didn't want to have to do this, it's going to hurt," he intoned with a hint of regret as Fu growled in response, lashing out suddenly. However, the redhead shifted his entire body around her clawed hands, lashing out with a strike of his own to plant a solitary paper tag on the verdette's forehead. A moment of calm followed before Fu reeled back, her entire body twitching uncontrollably as she cried out in pain. Visible streams of virulent orange energy began leaching off her body, drawn from the tag to the kunai Naruto had steadily planted around the area in a makeshift hexagon. The redhead could only watch in morbid fascination as the Biju's energy was quite literally ripped away from Fu's form. He had never needed to actually use this particular technique before, and it was quite the sight to see. He was in no way extracting the beast, of course, that would kill Fu. He was simply siphoning off the energy Fu was attempting to use, diverting it away from her chakra system and into the kunai. It would have likely worked as well, causing Fu to pass out from both the shock, pain, and sudden absence of the double-edged power. Would have. Suddenly the stealthily hidden kunai, given away by the streams of chakra connecting to the tag on Fu's head, began to shake and quiver like they had been taken upon by some invisible grip. A moment later and they were wrenched from the ground, hurtling across the forest and into the shadows. In the same moment a flood of what appeared to be plain white tags poured into the small clearing Naruto's attack had created. They enveloped Fu, covering and surrounding her like a cocoon spun by some papery spider. I'm afraid we cannot let you finish that jutsu Naruto Namikaze. A gruff, monotone voice called out from those same shadows. A figure soon joined it as a tall orange-haired man clad in a dark and all too recognizable cloak stepped out of Treeline. However, what had Naruto freezing in place for a moment was not the cloak he recognized as the Akatsuki's, but the man's eyes. The steel-gray ringed sclera that he had only ever heard stories, no, legends about bored into him. That second of hesitation cost him though as the man suddenly raised his hand. Shinra Tensei. No hand seal was made, there was no build-up of chakra, the man simply intoned a command and the world answered. An invisible wall of force that Naruto couldn't have possibly seen coming slammed into his unprepared form, tossing him like a rag doll away from the clearing. He managed to gain his senses in time to twist his body and land roughly in a three-point stance, but by that point the man's strange technique had thrown him hundreds of feet away. He was just lucky not to have hit any trees. However, before he could dash back towards the man, a wall of paper fluttered into the space in front of him, blocking his route and causing him to skid to a stop. It quickly resolved itself into the form of a blue-haired woman, floating a few feet of the ground with a cold expression and orange eyes not dissimilar to Fu's. She seemed incomplete, her body flaking off in places and seemingly composed of sheets of tightly packed paper. Naruto's first thought was that it was some kind of clone, however that was quickly dashed when she began to speak. I cannot allow you to interfere, you will not go any further than this. She motioned slowly to the wall of paper that even as she talked was beginning to encircle them. The redhead looked about for a second before shrugging and placing his hands in his pockets. If the woman was surprised by this, she hid it extremely well behind that indifferent facade. All right then, what exactly would I be interfering in? He asked, eyes carefully roaming the wall for any hint of a trap. He wouldn't believe for even a second there was no tricks hidden in whatever technique this was. The woman merely raised a single eyebrow less than a fraction of an inch, a truly impassive exterior. You do not care for the well-being of the Jinchuriki. If she had any genuine curiosity in the question, then her bland, disinterested tone didn't show it. You stopped me from completing a jutsu that, to you, likely looked as though it would have removed her biju, thus killing her. You aren't here to do that. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not yet anyway. He took the brief twitch of her hand and crinkle of her brow as a confirmation of that fact. There are two of you, and the Akatsuki are known to be comprised of powerful individuals. At the mention of her organization's name, the woman's reaction was slightly more visible. You are here for suppression, not elimination. You know of the Akatsuki. The woman replied blandly. Naruto took her evasion as another confirmation. You don't stay an Umbu captain for so long without learning about the freelance competition out there. For the first time in the conversation, Naruto's gaze hardened, losing its previous carefree quality. The question remained then of why such a powerful and, if rumors are true, expensive mercenary group after a Jinchuriki. It was a concerning notion. If they had been hired, then it was tantamount to an act of war from another village. It certainly wouldn't be Konoha. There were known missing nin within the organization, and Konoha did not affiliate itself with such groups. You do not need to know that. You must merely stay here until Pain-sama has left. She replied resolutely, however her brow crinkled at the same moment Naruto's raised, both realizing her mistake. Pain-sama. He repeated with a smirk. A name was a useful thing to know. The woman didn't seem all too eager on continuing the conversation though. Enough. She called, sweeping her arm out as a multitude of tags dotting the paper wall suddenly sprung to life, flipping around to reveal a seal all shinobi knew very well. However, as the explosive tags raced toward the redhead, he remained unconcerned, staring the brunette in the eye before giving a wink and tilting his head her way as if tipping his hat. Nice talk. It was almost lost among the ensuing explosions, but Konan was just able to make out the flash of red a millisecond before the first tag reached the Konoha shinobi. With a curse she called off the rest of her attack, great paper wings springing from her back as she took to the skies in the direction of her partner. Pain walked steadily through the forest. He was in no rush. Either Konan would keep Naruto busy long enough, or, if his reputation was to be believed, the Namikaze would have escaped already. Sure enough, the orange-haired man suddenly shot out his right hand. easily catching the sweeping kick that suddenly appeared in a flash of red. With a grip like steel he held the redhead there, eyes narrowing as he turned to meet the Konoha shinobi's gaze. You should have heeded Konan's warning. He suddenly let go of the redhead, palm opening in the same instance to blast him far away. However, Naruto was a quick learner if nothing else and was already gone before the attack had time to discharge. Instead, a tree a few meters away was violently ripped out of the earth and sent careening back, smashing a ragged path through the forest. Konoha? She didn't actually tell me her name. Pain's head lazily swiveled toward Naruto's new location, halfway up a nearby tree. He had not noticed the man throw any of his famed kunai. That was very impressive. However, it only made the Akatsuki member take the situation more seriously. You have no need to know of it. What do you intend to do now? The pierced man turned his full body toward the redhead, giving him a great view of Fu's unconscious body slung over his left shoulder. I warn you, if you attack me I will not hesitate to destroy you Kyubijin Shuriki. Naruto was only surprised for a moment before his gaze hardened once again. These people had suddenly turned from a notable threat to a true danger. Then maybe it's not best for me to engage, for now. Naruto commented, his legs waving absently. Once again, if the man was surprised by the comment, it did not show. Something about those perfectly stony exteriors on these two really irritated Naruto. However, suddenly he was gone, only to reappear a moment later in the same spot. Only Fu was now sat limply to his side. I will be taking this. Pain's mouth only twitched fractionally before his hand snapped up, palm already splayed. Bandesh before he could even get another syllable out, Naruto was gone, reappearing on another branch standing up. Fu was slung under one arm while the other leant against the trunk of the tree. I'm not letting you do another of your tricks again. He called down. As if to prove it, he vanished the moment Pain tried to point his hand in the redhead's direction again. Don't think of this as a retreat though. He vanished once more, only irritating Pain further. When he appeared it was behind a tree in Pain's blind spot. Think of this as me having better things to do. Another flash took him away as the tree he was behind was summarily obliterated by an invisible wall of energy. Just to be irritating, the final time he appeared it was directly in front of Pain, if only for a moment. Bye. And like that, he was gone. A minute later Konan landed in the small clearing to see Pain idly turning one of the Hiraishin kunai in his hands. However, even as he watched, the seal decorating the hilt slowly began to burn away, leaving nothing but a blank tool more useless than a normal kunai. Soon even that was reduced to scrap metal as Pain crushed the offending tool in his hand. Naruto sat across from the Hokage in the small, comfortable antechamber next to his office. His head was leaned back and he held the bridge of his nose to stave off the headache he just knew was coming. Fu had been taken into custody by the Umbu and he had been assured that she would be kept comfortable, but that didn't decrease his worry. There was also the matter of the Akatsuki, a powerful group that's intentions remained unknown. They were an unknown variable in all of this. This news is certainly troubling, I will admit. The aged Kage began slowly, weary eyes looking ahead at nothing in particular as he remained immersed within his own thoughts. I fear this may mark a turning point in this war, for better or for worse. Naruto looked back down at that, a sigh escaping his lips. Either Taki will realize they have lost their trump card and withdraw, or they will only grow more desperate. Naruto surmised grimly, already knowing the more likely of the two. The Hokage simply nodded, blowing out a gust of smoke from his pipe as he finally focused his eyes on the redhead. Both you and I know that if Orochimaru has his fingers in this, then the former will be impossible. He sighed, eyes turning to the window overlooking the village. Konoha is holding its ground in this fight, and given enough time we can and will end it. There was an air of finality in his words that one could not help but believe. There was a reason he was Hokage. However, he sighed again, and Naruto could safely say that he had never seen the older shinobi look his age quite so much. We are stretched thin at the moment along the northern border. We cannot afford these free radicals in the form of Akatsuki or anybody else running amok while we are weakened. His frown turned thoughtful as the famed mind of the professor continued to work on the problem like it was a puzzle lacking a few pieces. Things are only going to get more complicated from here on out, aren't they? Naruto asked tiredly. He hadn't even had a chance to see Anko since coming home and he was sorely missing his bed. However, as if summoned by some higher power with a twisted sense of humor, Anumbu suddenly dropped from the shadows. He leaned over and quickly whispered into the Hokage's ear, and even as he watched, Naruto could see the old man's already pale features whiten even further. When the operative vanished once more, Naruto simply raised an eyebrow only to receive a grave look from his commander. Shimakugai has been attacked. Naruto frowned at that. It was a small village on the northern border and was known for its tin mines, but other than that it held no real strategic value. It was also strangely out of the way for an attack, even from Otogakure. He sensed there was more though, and was quickly proven correct as the Hokage blew out another stream of smoke. Witnesses report the attack was carried out by Kumogakure shinobi. He intoned gravely. Like a shark smelling blood, a new player had entered the fray. You know. Twin sighs echoed through the still forest as Ami struck up conversation once again. However, the girl paid them no heed. Izumo and Katetsu are always complaining that gate duty is the most boring mission a chunin can be assigned. She grunted as she shifted the heavy backpack she was forced to carry as they trudged through the frosty landscape of northern Yunokuni. But at least they don't have to carry around weights heavier than themselves. Her only response was a grunt for her stoic Uchiha teammate. At least it was better than the utter indifference Hinata exuded. You know, it might not be so bad if you guys would actually talk for once and answer in more than monosyllables, or at all. She aimed a pointed look at Hinata's back, knowing that with her Byakugan active the girl could see it. However, the ever-aloof Hyuga princess didn't so much as glance her way, causing the violet to sigh irritably. I miss Sakura, at least she would talk to me. It sucks she got shifted to the MedCorp, stupid lack of mednin. She grumbled in futility as she kicked a clump of half-melted snow petulantly. On missions with Sasuke and Hinata she might as well have been assigned to escort some statues across the country. In each other's presences the scions of Konoha's two most prominent clans were completely intolerable. It made Ami almost thankful she hadn't been born with a jujutsu, almost. It was still a highly unfair advantage she consistently called Sasuke out on. Perhaps if you simply stopped whining and focused on the mission, it might pass quicker. Came the clipped response from the long-haired Hyuga. There was a tone of distinct displeasure there that Ami took satisfaction from. Anko really had been rubbing off on her a bit too much. Oh, so the princess does have a voice. Ami gasped in mock surprise, only to scoff a moment later when Hinata simply continued ignoring her. As if that would ever happen, these treks are about as boring as they come. A few moments of continual silence later and she let out another loud sigh before beginning to hum. There was no particular tune or melody, she was just trying to be as irritating as possible. Sure enough, after around a minute of the obnoxious noise, Hinata turned back and glared at her, the veins bulging around her eyes giving her a decidedly menacing look. Stop that! She ordered in a dark tone, only to have Ami stick out her tongue in a childlike manner. Instead she looked across at Sasuke, the current team leader, much to Hinata's consternation. Make her stop. The dark-haired teen merely grunted back, rolling his eyes in a mix of exasperation and amusement. He was a lot more used to Ami's antics and he held no great love for the Hyuga heir, so this arrangement suited him just fine. If I could, I would have a long time ago. He muttered unhelpfully only to wince as Ami appeared behind him, slinging an arm around his shoulder and pressing her body far too close to his for his liking. Ah, you know you love me, Sasuke-kun. Luckily she let go after a moment but didn't drop her cheeky smile, mostly because Hinata was still glaring at her. I preferred you when you were the useless daube. The Hyuga derided with a sneer only to have Ami cock her head in that direction with an easy grin. And I preferred you before your family stuck that massive stick up your ass. She responded, earning a disgusted look from the heiress as she turned to Sasuke. When did she become so crass? She asked in irritation, turning to the rather immature tactic of talking about Ami right in front of her. Sasuke on the other hand merely shrugged. Blame our sensei's psycho girlfriend. He finally responded, only to feel a dark presence as Ami once again wrapped her arm around his neck, this time just a little tighter. What was that about Anko-sensei? Out the corner of his eyes Sasuke could spot Ami's fingers twitch toward the hilt of the sword on her back. A single bead of sweat began to drop down the back of his neck as he noticed the familiar and all too sweet grin twisting Ami's lips. Damn, she had nearly gotten that down to a T, it was positively chilling. Luckily he was saved as Hinata suddenly raised her hand. Quiet you two, we're approaching the camp. After another squeeze from her arm, Ami detached from her teammate and slinked back to the rear of the formation. The formation itself was redundant, but they stuck to it out of habit. After all, with a Sharingan user and a Byakugan user on the team, there was little chance of an ambush. Plus, they were missing the usual fourth squad member due to Konoha's ranks being spread thin. In any case, it was just a simple supply delivery to a camp near the border with Shimo no Kuni, Kumo territory. The backpacks they carried were filled to the brim with storage scrolls containing new equipment and food. After a moment, though, even Ami's usual grin slipped away. Hinata's expression was dead serious and her eyes were straining even more than usual. Her pace slowed and the others followed suit, Sasuke's Sharingan spinning to life in his eyes. However, they were not designed for range and he could not make out whatever it was that had put Hinata on edge. "What is it?" he asked as they came to a stop just below the peak of the ridge that would overlook the small camp. "The camp is too empty, I'm only detecting 4 chakra signatures," she whispered back, her eyes slowly roaming across the camp hidden to the other 2. Suddenly, though, her eyes stopped, her face darkening at the same moment as her gaze became positively murderous. "Kumo shinobi, they've slaughtered the camp." Ami gasped while Sasuke's expression became more thoughtful. He was the squad leader, as honorary as that position was supposed to be for this mission, and it was up to him what they did now. Technically the correct option, the one he would be praised for when returning to the village, would be to gather information briefly before retreating. However, there was the small problem that Hinata had already begun to move forward, dashing silently into the tree line that ringed half the camp. Cursing inwardly, the Uchiha raced after her, motioning for Ami to follow him at a distance. When he alighted on a branch just behind the Hyuga, he grabbed her shoulder forcefully, only to have her turn around and glare at him. "What do you think you're doing?" she questioned venomously, shrugging his hand off her shoulder like it was on fire. He simply returned the glare with one of his own, made more intimidating by the 3 Tomo Sharingan rotating rapidly in the sea of red that were his eyes. "What are you doing? You'll give us away." Hinata scoffed and turned back to the camp, her Byakugan still blaring. "I wanted a better vantage point so that I could read their lips. We need to find out what they're doing here," she shot back imperiously, causing Sasuke to grumble, inwardly arguing with himself before finally nodding, albeit reluctantly. He might as well make the most of the situation. "What are they saying then?" he finally said in a hushed whisper. He suddenly agreed with Ami and wished Sakura was here instead. At least then they could communicate silently through the hand signs Naruto had taught them. "Nothing useful. I think they're just the cleanup squad. The main force must be elsewhere by now," she responded, her tone becoming more professional, earning another nod from Sasuke. "That would make sense. Can you tell what rank they are?" "If they were just a squad of genin, then they might be able to capture them. Even if they were chunin, they would have a shot. If there is a jonin among them, though." Well, it was enough to say that Naruto had beaten some respect for the difference in ability between ranks. "I can't tell. Their chakra levels would indicate either powerful chunin or dash." Her eyes widened suddenly before she dived off the branch. Sasuke followed, his Sharingan having caught the 2 speeding kunai at the last moment and allowing him to dodge them easily. However, the way they were thrown, in a strange curved arc, forced them forward into the camp. Immediately they were surrounded by 3 Kumo shinobi while the last stayed further away. He had his fingers pressed to the ground and a look of concentration on his face. "We take offense to that. We may be fresh, but a jounin's a jounin, yano." A blonde-haired man that looked no older than 18 started up with a cocky grin, causing both Hinata and Sasuke to tense as both easily slipped into their families' stances. "Don't get any funny ideas, kids." A far more serious-looking man with dark skin and unnaturally gray hair cut in, the scars crisscrossing his body, speaking of a lot of experience. "Hey, I think this one's the Uchiha kid." The last of the trio piped up, a young woman who also had dark skin and white hair. All 3 had blades of different kinds strapped to their bodies, and all 3 were now staring at Sasuke intently, most notably at his eyes. He tried to ensnare them in a genjutsu at that moment, however the shinobi that had hung back, a tanned man with wavy red hair and a blindfold across his eyes, cleared his throat. "I wouldn't try it, kid." He spoke up in a gruff tone. At the same moment both Konoha Chunin felt a pulse of chakra travel through the ground, snapping the genjutsu on the 3 Kumonin. "Don't look him in the eyes." He spoke with a commanding tone, and the 3 Kumo shinobi looked a little sheepish for being caught out. he was obviously the commander. The man slowly turned his attention of Sasuke, looking right at him despite the blindfold. What's an Uchiha doing all the way out here? Doesn't Konoha have a better hold over its assets? The leader asked in a calm, rough tone. It seemed to imply an age greater than his appearance would suggest. Heh, those Sharingan are a pretty rare commodity nowadays. The blonde spoke up tauntingly. My eyes are not a commodity. Sasuke growled, earning him a sour look from Hinata that obviously said, don't let them rile you up. However, it seemed a lost cause as the cocky blonde continued with a grin. Sure they are, after that Itachi guy went all psycho and butchered the lot. Oh yeah, those things became worth your weight in gold. Sasuke's eyes twitched and his hands clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles became white. The leader of the Kumo group seemed to be sending a warning look to his subordinate, but he continued anyway. Sept, I heard he's the real strong one, so I imagine his eyes must be worth like 3 times yours, yeah no. That seemed to be the last straw for Sasuke though, as he suddenly dashed forward. However, this seemed to be exactly what the blonde was waiting for, as in a flash his sword was off his back and he'd slipped into an indecipherable stance. He was surprised then when Sasuke circumvented his first, second, and third strikes with a deft ease. His eyes span rapidly as they showed him the movement of the katana before the Kumonin actually made them. His glare was burning as he ducked into the man's guard with a blow that would have crippled his temple. However, with a strangled cry he was sent skidding backwards towards Hinata, clutching his throat as his eyes watered. Suddenly the Kumo squad leader had interposed himself between the two shinobi, the hilt of his sword pointed in Sasuke's direction. Hinata blinked in surprise, not having even seen him move, only to cringe as he turned his sightless gaze on them. I do not appreciate people attacking my subordinates. He took a step forward only to pause. Suddenly his blade came around in a flash of steel as an ear-shattering clang rang through the desolate camp. There was an incredible moment where Ami simply hung there, suspended by the grinding contact between her blade and the squad captain's. However, it couldn't last and, eyes narrowing, she used the leverage to flip herself over the man, placing herself between the Kumonin and her squad mates. Hinata, take Sasuke, and get out of here. Sasuke looked ready to argue with that order but was currently suffering from a case of half-crushed windpipe and could only manage a few weak choking noises. The Hyuga seemed more indecisive, watching hesitantly as Ami took her stance, her expression becoming like steel. I'll hold them off for as long as I can, just go. At that, Hinata took one look at the confused but hurriedly reorganizing Kumo shinobi and the gasping Uchiha at her feet, grabbed him by the shoulder and took off in the opposite direction as fast as she was able. Your comrades have abandoned you. The Kumo captain intoned slowly as he wearily eyed Ami's stance. It was a habit of swordsmen to be wary of styles they did not recognize. How long do you really think you can hold us off? Eventually we will simply defeat you and chase them down. However, he saw no waver in Ami's expression, it was one of pure determination. I have to at least try. She shot back with a steely tone, the grip around her hilt tightening as he feet shuffled in accordance with his own movements. However, the man didn't seem fully focused on her, instead raising a hand and ordering his subordinates to chase after her teammates. Before they could even move, Ami's sword sliced through the air like a silver flash. Instantly a small crevice was carved between her and the Kumonin. She seemed to have at least caught their attention. Don't ignore me, she growled. You won't cross that line. All 4 of the shinobi looked at her in interest before all of them reached for their respective blade. If it is a Kenjutsu fight you want, young Konoha Kunoichi, then you have chosen poor opponents. Despite the taunt from the far more stoic squad leader, Ami couldn't but help smirking cheekily. Oh, I know, I'll try to go easy on you guys. Ami collapsed to her knees, her body battered and cut all over as she crept backwards across the ground. It was useless though, behind her only lay a high cliff and below that a rather uninviting river roared faintly in her ears. She'd like to think she had put up a fair fight, keeping the Kumo shinobi at least occupied for a few minutes in what she hoped was enough time for her teammates to escape. However, soon enough the others had peeled off, leaving her to face against their captain alone. It quickly became obvious who was more proficient with the sword. She took pride in the small wounds she had managed to inflict. I praise your teacher, he taught you well. The red-haired man spoke as he advanced on the beaten girl, spinning his blade once to remove it of her blood before sheathing it on his back. Ami would have felt insulted at the gesture, but honestly, she was only barely able to crawl at this point, never mind launch any kind of assault. She couldn't even speak. The man seemed fond of aiming for the throat with his hilt, and despite never giving him a direct hit, the repeated attacks had taken their toll. Still, she settled for flipping him the bird as she inched her way closer to the cliff. Anko would expect no less. Cute. The man intoned drolly as Ami finally reached the cliff. With nowhere left to go, he slowed his pace, advancing forward with an easy gait. However, for just a moment he saw her eyes flicker downwards, his own widening in response as she suddenly used the last of her strength to push herself back. He jumped forward to catch her, but only grasped at air as she fell out of his reach and into the swirling waters below. He gave the foaming waters a cursory glance before sighing at the wasted potential and walking away. A solitary man slowly walked down the sandbank of a river, hands in his cloak's pockets. It was relaxing to watch the waters ebb and flow endlessly. However, something one wouldn't normally expect to find in such a place caught his eye. A young girl, her clothing torn and shredded with injuries littering her body, was tiredly, and with great effort, dragging herself onto shore with what seemed to be her only working arm. From the state of her, it seemed miraculous she was even conscious, and the man approached carefully. She didn't even seem to notice him until he was almost directly next to her, and that was only because she had rolled herself over and lay there gasping on the riverbank like some beached fish. At that point her entire field of vision was taken up by his face, at least it would have been if it weren't for the mask covering it. The last thing she focused before the energy finally left her body was the glint of red she caught behind the mask's single eye hole. Chapter 34, Familiar Reunions. Two cloaked figures moved silently through a darkened passage, lit only occasionally by the flickering fires of sparsely placed torches. Their feet made no sound against the dusty, well-worn ground despite one of their number's apparent interest in their surroundings. His head swiveled occasionally, eyebrow quirking at the seemingly uninteresting locale. The other simply strode forward with measured, confident steps, his red eyes smoldering beneath their wide-brimmed gaza. "So, come here often?" One finally spoke up, breaking the previously comfortable silence, at least in the opinion of his companion. At his lack of response, the larger man simply continued on, chuckling lightly to himself as he glanced about the tunnel again. "I never realized Konoha was so easy to break into." He placed his hands up by his head, displacing the large wrapped object strapped to his back. "Just a nice, quiet stroll down a passageway," he grunted, hands returning to his side. "Bit boring if you ask me." He glanced at his companion only to see him continue on stoically. It wasn't like the man to rise to his casual conversation, so he was surprised when his dulcet tones graced his ears. "Exit tunnels like these are common for Umbu operatives," he intoned softly, continuing on before his companion could make a wise crack, "for all of the villages." The larger man nodded with a roll of his beady eyes, grinning to reveal a row of sharpened teeth. "I suppose you'd know." This time his partner remained silent, and they continued on for another good few minutes in that manner. "You know," the larger one started up again, much to the silent chagrin of his companion, "I thought you'd have a bit more to say, what with coming home again." At that the smaller one grunted, his features not changing in the slightest. "Konoha has not been my home for over 6 years now, this is simply a mission," he responded coolly, not a hint of emotion seeping into his tone. That only seemed to make his companion even more determined to get under his skin though. Before he had a chance, however, the youngest of the pair raised his hand. "Stop, the exit is just up ahead, we will have to be discreet from here on." The blue-skinned of the pair grunted but acquiesced all the same. He suspected his partner just wanted a bit of quiet. They made it up and out of the old abandoned Umbu tunnel just fine with the use of a subtle earth jutsu, and quickly concealed themselves in the shadows of the late evening streets. However, oddly enough, there wasn't even a hint of activity around them, no civilians, no shinobi, the streets were eerily empty. "So this is Konoha during a war, huh?" The bigger one muttered under his breath, glancing about curiously. Something seemed off with how easy this had all been so far. No Umbu patrols to run into, not even a hint of trouble getting past the barriers. Even with his former Konoha companion he expected a bit more resistance. "I would not know," was his partner's only reply. "Now quiet, Kisame, the Umbu holding cells are this way." The former Kirinin waved the Uchiha off as the two slunk through the streets, flitting between shadows without a whisper. Once again they were unnerved by lack of apparent defenses in place around the village, easily slipping into the nondescript building that served as a holding pen for some of Konoha's more sensitive acquisitions. By this point Itachi practically knew something had to be wrong. Several Umbu standard orders had been breached with the lack of general security, and they should have at least had to deal with a patrol by now. I had the foresight to send them away. A quiet, toneless voice seemed to answer their unspoken queries as a certain redhead made his presence known. Instantly Itachi and Kisame's muscles tensed, although they showed no outward signs of it. Naruto. Itachi acknowledged with a slight tilt of his head, as if they were just old friends greeting after a few weeks apart and hadn't last seen each other at the end of the other's kunai. Wouldn't want to get some poor little Umbu involved in the big boy games after all. The former captain continued on as if he hadn't heard the man he used to consider a brother, his face looking rather bored for facing down two of the most dangerous Nukenin to grace the elemental nations. So you're the famous second coming of the Flash, huh? Kisame finally spoke up, casually tossing aside his Sujigaza to reveal his blue-toned skin and gill-like tattoos. I expected you to be bigger. He titled his head with a toothy grin, maybe a little bloodier, the nickname doesn't quite fit. The redhead regarded the enormous man evenly, his eyes never straying toward the slowly rotating Sharingan of his former friend. Kisame Hoshigake. He intoned blandly, as if reading a target out of a bingo book. It seemed to be most of a confirmation than an actual acknowledgement of the man's presence. The Jinchuriki is not here, is she? It wasn't really a question, and Itachi's tone reflected that. She's safe. Naruto finally replied, stepping further out of the shadows of the dimly lit hallway and into a casual, unconcerned slouch worthy of Inara. Sua. You're a Jinchuriki. Anko started up cheerily, if not with a hint of uncertainty, as she stared across the room at the mint-haired girl seated on the couch. Fu's feet and hands were bound and there was a chakra-suppressing collar around her neck, so all she could really do was glare at the overly chipper Violet. I heard you met Naruto at his Chunin exams. Anko ventured again, feeling incredibly awkward having to play host to a woman who not a few days ago had tried to kill her boyfriend, yet supposedly was a good friend of his. He had just dumped her on the couch this afternoon, telling her to watch over her until he got back without even telling her why. Fu merely continued her piercing glare, rolling her shoulders to ease the discomfort of her restraints. Wanna play cards? Anko asked, before chuckling sheepishly as Fu's look finally changed into one of incredulity. The verdette glanced down at her restraints before glaring back up at the girl. Right, no hands. The two women once again lapsed into an awkward silence, with Anko in the room, though it couldn't last for long. So you're a Jinchuriki? I won't let the Akatsuki have her, so this is as far as you go. The redhead stated resolutely, his lazy posture vanishing in an instant as he straightened himself up, a tri-pronged kunai appearing in his hand faster than his opponents could blink. Well dash. Kisame was cut off from his snarky comment as he was suddenly and violently pulled out the way by Itachi, a flash of silver steel slicing through the space where his neck had once occupied with a visible whine of displaced air. There was a moment of stillness before, in the same moment, a hair-thin slice appeared in the wall behind them and forms of Naruto and Itachi vanished into a red flash and a murder of crows respectively. I see you're as fast as ever, Naruto. Itachi monotoned softly, Sharingan spinning calmly to pick out the locations already marked out by the redhead's hiration. There were more than a few. You're still a fan of your illusions as well, I see. The redhead responded glibly, sword already sheathed in a movement that only Itachi's Dojutsu picked up. Beside him Kisame rubbed at his neck with a mildly sheepish grin before slinging Samehada off his back with a vicious grin. Itachi's lips only quirked downward for a single instance. You know of the Akatsuki. The Uchiha intoned with less inflection than a bored Nara, trying to buy the pair a bit of time to think their way out of this situation while hoping Naruto still had a bit of a conversational streak with his enemies. Jiraiya decided to fill me in when he felt I was ready to know. The redhead air-quoted with a snort, his posture outwardly relaxing in a bluff Itachi knew all too well. Naruto never truly relaxed in these situations. That does sound like the Toad Sage. Itachi agreed, mind whirling as he considered every exit out of Konoha and which would be best for escaping his former friend and teammate. The options were worryingly slim now that Naruto had mastered his father's famous technique. Yeah, and he also told me what he knew of the Akatsuki's current lineup, which is why I knew that pain. Only Kisame showed a hint of surprise at Naruto knowing the name of their leader, would send you to retrieve Fu. The redhead's eyes darkened slightly as an almost invisible pressure settled on the corridor. Nobody knows the village better after all. The pressure from Naruto's chakra was nothing to the 2's rank, but the slight shimmer around the redhead's body spoke of his barely restrained emotions. Kisame, we should retreat, we are in a disadvantageous position here. Itachi urged quietly, hands already flashing through signs in a hurried but coordinated blur. His grand fireball technique roared down the corridor, singing the walls and creating a partial vacuum in the confined, underground space. It was a fairly standard attack, one he was sure Naruto could dodge in his sleep, however that was not its purpose. He simply wanted to see how ingrained the Hiraishin seals were into their tagged medium. He received his answer when Naruto appeared back in the corridor with a rather extravagant crimson flash. Retreat. Kisame seemed genuinely hurt by the comment, even if his sadistic grin said otherwise. I'm hurt you think me so inept, Itachi-san. He growled happily, the bundle in his hand suddenly exploding outward to reveal a 6-foot-long stretch of jagged and vicious-looking blue scales, a sword in the vaguest sense of the word. I've always wanted a crack at the bloody Flash, ever since I heard he took Kushimaru's head. I wasn't. Itachi trailed off when he noticed Kisame was taking no notice of him, already charging down the hallway with a look of childish excitement plastered to his features. Samehada screeched as the blue giant scraped the unwieldy blade down the length of the hallway. It seemed to chatter excitedly as he swung it in a powerful arc that no normal human should have been able to dodge, at least in such a cramped space. Bit out of your comfort zone, Hoshigaki-san? Naruto asked curiously, hand under his chin as he crouched on top of Kisame's blade, once again proving he was no normal human by flashing onto the swordsman's famous weapon. He backflipped off almost immediately, simultaneously dodging a not-so-small hail of fire and shrouded shuriken and the spikes on Samehada suddenly thickening in an attempt to skewer his feet. Kisame's grin only widened, if that was possible, as he planted his blade against the floor. Cocky aren't we, kid? The former Kirinin growled out without the normal threat that laced his voice. If there was one thing he appreciated, it was a worthy opponent. He did however seem a tad annoyed Naruto refused to meet his eye, although that was more to do with the fact that Naruto was focusing on the pair's feet. It was the one place on Itachi's body he was almost sure the Uchiha couldn't cast his genjutsu from. It was a bit hindering, but his reflexes allowed him to anticipate their movements in a somewhat bastardist form of Guy's counter to the Sharingan. Only as much as I need to be. The redhead shot back with a smirk, only to tense as Kisame and Itachi began running through hand seals together. It seemed the two weren't going to try and take him on one at a time. Itachi's technique was first, being the faster of the two with his hand seals, water release, water fang bullet. He called out in his soft tones, the deadly technique rapidly spiraling up instead of at Naruto. It smashed right through the ceiling of the corridor at the same moment Kisame finished his own technique, drawing in a massive breath as he paused on the snake seal. He didn't even call out the name of the technique, simply spouting out an absurd volume of water from seemingly nowhere that rapidly rushed both down the corridor toward Naruto and up out of the fresh hole his partner had created. A few moments later and Naruto flashed onto the roof of the Umbu holding cells, shaking out his now wet hair with an irritated expression. This was why he hated missions to Kirigakure. It was such an inconvenience being wet, it weighed him down and chilled his muscles. He quickly observed the damage only to sigh in relief, with most of the water channeled up the surrounding streets were only flooded instead of destroyed like the pressure might have done otherwise. Pulling a scroll out of one of his pouches he quickly smeared some blood across the seal and threw it into the water. Almost immediately it began to drain away into the scroll like Naruto had pulled some invisible plug. Ah, didn't you like my redecorating? Kisame snarked as he appeared across from the redhead, Samehada lazily resting on his shoulder. He didn't give the redhead enough time to respond though as he suddenly shot forward at speeds that belied his bulky form. However when the Naruto his blade sheared through merely smirked his beady eyes widened. Itachi watched on impassively from an elevated position as the clone of Naruto violently exploded outwards in a familiar technique he himself had taught the redhead. He probably should have warned his partner but it seemed unnecessary when Kisame jumped back from the smoke cloud, only a little singed for the trouble. The Uchiha merely assumed Samehada had absorbed too much of the clone's chakra for the explosion to have done much damage. Damn, your friend is beginning to piss me off, Itachi. Kisame growled as he glanced about at their surroundings. The stoic Uchiha was about to correct him when Naruto beat him to it, appearing a few feet away on the rooftop dancing from foot to toot, noticeably dry. That traitor's no friend of mine, sushi roll. Both combatants missed the ever so slight twitch in Itachi's eye, too focused on one another as they were. Now move aside, I don't really feel like dicing you up today. His violet eyes drifted in the direction of Itachi, still not meeting the Sharingan's lulling gaze. I was trying to have a nice reunion here with a former teammate. It seemed that was the last straw for Kisame as the large man chuckled lowly, a familiar expression crossing his face that Itachi had come to recognize as the Nukenin becoming serious. Oh yeah, this one's mine, Itachi, I don't care what history you have. His grin turned positively savage as he pointed Samehada at the redhead. I hope you don't mind if I make the bloody Flash live up to his moniker, do you? The Uchiha simply exhaled slowly, knowing nothing he said was going to hold his partner back now. Instead he returned to scoping out their surroundings, wondering why no reinforcements had arrived yet. Surely Naruto didn't believe he could take them both on, it was too suspicious. They were near the boundaries of the village, sure, but still. Kisame, be cautious. He tried to warn, for all the affect it had on the Kirinin as the man suddenly blasted forward, swinging Samehada forward with all his strength. Surprisingly, Naruto actually parried the blade, catching it between scales with his own tanto. Itachi recognized it scratch for scratch as the one the redhead had used when they were still both in Umbu. The Uchiha couldn't even remember where he had abandoned his own. The redhead seemed to struggle under Kisame's strength but at least kept the unusual blade from cutting him. Well, you're stronger than Zabuza, that's for sure. He ground out, suddenly vanishing in a crimson flash. The sudden lack of resistance only put Kisame off balance for a moment before he swung Samehada around again, deflecting a glancing blow from the speedster. He was ready to counter only to have Naruto vanish again. Itachi could see what the redhead was doing and it didn't bode well for Kisame. He remembered how Naruto would scope out his opponent's strength and reflexes in this exact manner. Hardly a compliment, kid, I could beat that muscled-up idiot with one arm. Kisame shot back with a smirk, glancing about for any flashes of red that would give away his opponent's position. Move. Itachi intoned blandly, causing Kisame to jump back just as Naruto appeared right where he had been standing, tanto held in a reverse grip and tri-pronged kunai thrust forward. Not too fast though, are you? Naruto grinned, flashing off again so only his voice remained on the roof. Kushimaru was more of a challenge than you, at least he. He appeared behind Kisame, causing the man to swing at nothing as he suddenly appeared atop Samehada again, lashing out with a vicious kick that nearly broke the fish-like man's nose, could sort of keep up. Kisame growled angrily, flashing through hand seals and slamming his palms down only to remember all of his water had been taken away. Don't get riled up, Kisame. Itachi once again offered helpfully from the rooftop. He knew better than anybody just how good the redhead could be at getting under people's skin. It was the main reason Shisui lost a lot of spars against the Namikaze. Thankfully the Kirinin seemed to take his advice on board, taking a calming breath before scouting out his surroundings. What is he doing, Itachi? He called up, knowing the Uchiha had the better perspective with his elevated position and Sharingan. Itachi merely arched an eyebrow as he glanced down, inwardly still wondering about the lack of reinforcements. I thought you did not wish me to interfere. He shot back blandly, only to receive a toothy grin as Kisame's reflexes took over and he blocked a downward sweep of Naruto's tanto. You know me so well, partner. He growled out, staring into Naruto's violet eyes with a hungry energy as he pushed back against the Namikaze's blade, easily overpowering him. Naruto flipping back casually, shifting his stance a little as he nodded up to Itachi without actually looking at the teen. Might want to be careful there, he's been known to betray his partners. He flashed suddenly onto Samehada again but Kisame had the foresight to lean back from the sweeping kick. He tried to reach forward and grab the offending leg only for Naruto to flash once again down the street, when the whim strikes. Kisame growled at how easily the redhead was closing the distance between them before noticing Samehada squirm uncomfortably in his hand. The blade was drawing attention to the dark seal imposed on its scales, which quickly glowed and vanished as Kisame willed the blade to absorb the chakra from it. "Oh, you noticed?" Naruto questioned nonchalantly, hand entering his pockets as the other sheathed his blade. "Shame you forgot." Kisame suddenly felt a blinding pain ring inside his skull as he found a knee encompass his vision, "The one on your face." The next few seconds felt like they were stretched out into minutes for the Kirinin as Naruto proceeded to vanish and reappear what felt like 100 times, each time landing a vicious or well-placed strike somewhere on his body. When he finally ceased the assault, Kisame was still very blue, but a whole lot more black. "You're not looking so good there, sushi roll." The redhead smirked as Kisame's eyes refused to focus for a few moments. He finally regained his bearings, lashing out with Samehada only for Naruto to flash across the street, lazily resting against a wall. "Maybe you should slow down." The follow-up slash was once again dodged as this time the Namikaze appeared on Kisame's other side, still leaning casually on a wall. "Relax a bit, maybe have a rest." Kisame's eye merely twitched as he brought the full force of Samehada down on the redhead, only for it to hit nothing but the ground, cratering it instantly. "Hold still, you little runt, or I'll give you something to dodge," he growled, eye twitching sporadically. However, when he spotted Naruto up on a rooftop, feet swinging over the edge as carefree as could be, something inside of him snapped. "I wouldn't do that," Naruto sang tauntingly, only to flash away as a ton of scaly death tried to lodge itself in his head. "I'm warning you." He waggled his finger like a parent might to a disappointing child. "It's a bad idea," he jibed in a whimsical tone as he once again infuriatingly avoided Kisame's swing with the ease one might in a spar against a genin. "That's it, kid, screw subtlety," Kisame shouted, a vein on his forehead pulsing dangerously as he slammed his hands together. "You call this subtle?" The redhead chuckled as he glanced about at the ruined street they were fighting in, or at least he appeared to be looking at the damage. "Yeah, laugh it up, enjoy your last moments." The fishman growled as he completed his hand seals in a combination Naruto recognized and unfortunately for Kisame, had been waiting for. Water release, great exploding water colliding wave. Far from his previous technique, a veritable ocean of water spewed from Kisame's mouth, rapidly forming into a tidal wave as it only continued to expand. However, as the shadow of the enormous mass of liquid bared down on the redhead, he looked unconcerned, even a little disappointed. "I warned you," he muttered, lost against the roar of Kisame's technique as he raised a single half-ram seal. Instantly 4 tags, placed around the street Kisame had been lured into by his enraged assault, glowed as invisible lines of chakra snaked out between them. Uzumaki style, 4-pillar prison seal. Even Kisame faltered as the massive influx of chakra suddenly roared to life, a thick purple barrier springing up not only between him and the redhead, but all around him in an all-encompassing cube. By the time he knew what was happening, it was already too late and his technique had completely filled up the inside of the cube. Unfortunately for him, it didn't stop there. He had already expended the chakra, there was no stopping the technique. Naruto watched, cringing slightly from outside the barrier he was maintaining as the water pressure within the cube only continued to grow. Kisame, trapped inside by his own technique, convulsed and writhed as his body was crushed mercilessly. Inside the cube, the former Kirinin found himself actually smirking as his vision blackened and blood escaped his mouth in little pink swirls. He always knew his anger would get the best of him one day, and as he glanced up to the rooftop where Itachi had been watching the fight only to find it empty, he sighed, nothing but bubbles escaping his constricted lungs. Figures. And then he saw nothing but black. Itachi never looked back as he quietly strode away from the village, hat returned to its place on his head. However, he did pause, for just a moment, as a breeze caught the edge of his robe. It was just for a moment though before he continued on, blazing red eyes set forward and Sujigaza lowered to shade his features. "Sorry, Kisame." He sighed slowly as he vanished into the shadows of Konoha's famous trees, his voice just a whisper on the wind. "Sorry, Naruto." Naruto sighed in irritation as he held up a paper seal to the side of the glowing barrier, watching as the water drained, in his opinion far too slowly, from inside. "Did you manage to tag him?" He called out to seemingly no one, only for a shadow to slip out of a nearby wall, their presence previously indistinguishable from the surroundings. "Sorry Taiya, Naruto, He seemed to notice something when I got too close. Komaki apologized nervously, fiddling with one of the senbon she usually kept in her hair. It had been her job to try and sneak up on Itachi and stick him with the same kind of tracking seal Naruto had used on Gurren. Konoha needed to know where the Akatsuki was based, even if Naruto had to set aside his personal feelings regarding his former friend. However, getting close to the Uchiha Scion was like passing under the gaze of an apex predator. Even for Komaki it felt like every time she got even remotely close those swirling red eyes were locked right on her. It's alright, it was a long shot to begin with. The redhead sighed, masking his disappointment. He knew better than anyone that it was no easy task sneaking up on an Uchiha, never mind Itachi. I'll just finish up here and go report to Hiruzen. Komaki nodded quickly, inwardly glad just to be done with this assignment, despite the failure. However, as she left, another Umbu seemed to materialize into position, taking her place. If anything, the boar-masked man seemed even more nervous than her. Anamikaze-san. I have some news. Naruto raised an eyebrow, not taking his attention off the cube he was still draining. It's about the Chunin team we sent to the Ta border, your former squad. The Hokage thought it best you know. Ami heard her groan echo around her as she blinked her eyes open, instantly regretting it as the light pierced her retinas like hot pokers. Taking a moment to get used to the swimming sensation in the back of her head and take stock of all the aches across her body, she eventually managed to prop herself up on her elbows, taking in what appeared to be a cave through blurry vision. She glanced about, noting the campfire a short distance away from her before her eyes naturally drifted to the man stoking it. AHH. She could help but shriek as she caught sight of his face, or what appeared to be his face in her disoriented view. It looked more like some kind of demon than any kind of man she knew, with a gruesomely stretched grin and a single, evilly winking eye. She jumped back only to immediately regret it, forgetting the demonic visage as pain lanced through her side. It felt like her chest had been caved in, only to be reset and caved in again. Whoa, take it easy. The man finally noticed her conscious state, crossing the distance between them faster than was natural, only for Ami to scoot back even more. She pushed the pain to the back of her mind as best she could in order to escape the monster, but it still showed on her face. After a moment of confusion, the man's single visible eye, a deep obsidian black, widened in realization and he pulled at his own face. Ami realized it was a mask at the same moment he tossed it to the side carelessly, a sheepish grin passing over surprisingly handsome features. Oh, sorry about that, sometimes I forget I'm even wearing it. He muttered, more to himself than to her. It took a moment, but Ami's vision did clear enough to get a good look at him. But beyond her initial assessment she didn't learn much. Untidy black hair fell about his face and it looked like he had been growing it for a good few years as it tumbled messily across his right eye, obscuring it. He chuckled again, rubbing the back of his head in a way that reminded Ami far too much of Naruto. Don't worry about the mask, it's just something I wear to scare the locals off. He sighed, staring out the mouth of the surprisingly spacious cave they occupied. Sometimes it's a bit too effective, I like my privacy as much as the next guy, but... He trailed off, seemingly realizing he had been rambling as he noticed Ami's incredulous expression. But are you okay? I found you washed up on the beach, pretty banged up. I wrapped you up the best I could, but, medical stuff was never really my strong suit. Ami looked down, noticing her chest and a few of her larger wounds on her arms and legs were wrapped up. Thank you. She finally managed in a somewhat hoarse voice, taking the hint the messy-haired man quickly scrambled across the cave, returning with a flask of water for her. As she drank she noticed a neat stack of her clothes off to one side, only then noticing that she seemed to have been changed into thankfully dry spares she kept with her equipment. Noticing her look she almost wanted to laugh as the man turned a virulent shade of red, averting his gaze. I didn't look, promise. He squeaked, making Ami chuckle slightly as she finished her drink with a satisfied sigh. Who are you? She diverted, quick to move away from the idea of any looking or lack thereof. Anko would have been disappointed in her for not at least trying to tease the man over it, but she was too sore and too tired to care. He also looked thankful for the change of subject, grinning nervously as he ran a hand through his dark hair. Just your friendly neighborhood hermit. He seemed a little evasive, but Ami could excuse a little eccentricity from the man who probably saved her life. A rather awkward silence seemed to press down on them for a few moments before Ami's stomach rumbled, echoing uncomfortably in the spacious cave. Right, food. The man nodded, scrambling up and away towards a few crates to the back of the inlet. Ami sighed thankfully before looking about the space she found herself in, trying to glean just where exactly that river had carried her. She never noticed the man take a subtle glance back at her, his left eye swirling for a moment into a deep scarlet. By the time she looked back though his visage was back to sheepish as if nothing had changed, hand once again submerged in that shock of black hair. Well, I have fish, or fish? Chapter 35, Familiar Revelations. Ami stared across at the man in front of her, ravenously eating away at his skewered fish. It appeared that being a hermit did little for one's table manners. That, combined with her still fuzzy head and various body aches, was making her feel a little green, and her own fish on a stick went largely untouched. She used the opportunity instead to try and glean anything she could about her rescuer. His long, unruly hair made pinpointing his age a little difficult, but he was definitely older than her, by maybe 5 or 6 years. He was handsome, as she had thought before, and for some reason a lot of his features reminded her of Sasuke. This of course led to her imagining said teammate with similarly long, messy hair, only to nearly choke on her mouthful from laughter. She couldn't imagine the proud and, although he wouldn't admit it, vain Uchiha Scion with anything less than his perfect hair. The man was dressed rather plainly and a lot of his clothes seemed heavily worn and patched, but she supposed hermits didn't have a lot of motivation to go clothes shopping. Speaking of which, she thought hermits were supposed to be old, antisocial grouches with too much about the world to complain about. This young man in front of her didn't seem the type. For one, he just seemed so carefree. There was an energy to his movements, beyond the fact that Ami could definitely feel the chakra within him. It was surprisingly powerful and, even more shockingly, the only thing she could compare it to would be her sensei. So, he finally spoke up, noticing her not eating her food and finishing up with his own, "What's going on in the world?" Seeing her blank look, he elaborated, once again scratching the back of his head in a way that was so infuriatingly. Naruto. Not a lot of news reaches this little part of the world. He smirked to himself as a chuckle escaped his lips, especially round my neck of the woods. He laughed, only to quiet as Ami continued to stare at him blankly. Oh, that would have been funnier if you knew we were in the woods. He stated lamely, only to look down and grumble to himself when Ami didn't give him so much as a smile. Nobody appreciates good comedy anymore. Ami actually found herself sighing at the almost pathetic sight before her. No grown man should be moping around like that. Is that why you became a hermit, to hone your comedy? She offered dryly, throwing him a bone only to have him grin like a loon. Amongst other things. He evaded, still grinning. Now come on, I think a bit of current affairs is the least you can do for dragging you out of that river. Ami sighed before shrugging. The man seemed harmless enough, and he had saved her. Well, I suppose you mean aside from the war. Upon seeing his raised eyebrow, she nearly dropped her fish in the fire. You don't even know about the war. He simply shrugged. I don't think you quite understand just how far into nowhere we are, kid. Ami pouted at being called a kid before sobering. That's another thing, where exactly am I? She was surprised when the man procured a map from seemingly nowhere, and not just any map. Hey, that's mine. He shushed her, waving his hand at her petulantly before pointing vaguely at a position near the river she had drifted down. Just about here, more or less. Ami scowled at the man before her expression became more thoughtful. She had drifted nearly half a kilometer away from the cliffs, but more importantly from her teammates. She could only hope that she had bought them enough time to get away. So tell me about this war. The man spoke up, pulling her out of her worried thoughts and back into the present. I assume Konoha is involved. Suddenly Ami's muscles locked up as her entire form became defensive and suspicious. Immediately the man raised his hands innocently. Whoa, calm down, I saw your headband. He quickly placated, the offending item suddenly hanging from his hands. Ami quickly snatched the length of cloth and metal away from him, giving him as mean a scowl as she could manage with what felt like a half-dozen bruised ribs. Stop stealing my stuff. He just grinned innocently. As a hermit, I prefer borrowed, hoping you wouldn't notice it was gone. It makes me come off a bit better, right? His form seemed to slump a little when Ami just narrowed her eyes. That's stealing. She muttered in irritation, only growing more annoyed when he shrugged nonchalantly. Kunai, same difference. He shot back with a disarming smile. After grumbling to herself for a few moments about hermits that couldn't respect personal property, she acquiesced. Yeah, Konoha is at war with Kusa, Taki, Oto. She admitted, before remembering the circumstances that brought her here in the first place. And Kumo. The man let out a long whistle, looking at the wall of a cave for a moment with wide eyes. Damn, how did they manage that? That's the entire northern border. He didn't notice Ami's eyes narrowing a little at the observation. Well, what else is going on in the world? You're a kunoichi, right? What's going on in Konoha? He asked suddenly, diverting the conversation. What does it matter to you? Ami jibed defensively, nibbling at her fish as an excuse not to answer. I get curious about all you shinobi types, you know, a lot of stories fly around about you guys. He shot right back with a grin. When she didn't answer, he pressed a bit more. What about teammates? Sensei? Must have been someone good for you to survive the injuries you had. It was more like a reflex at that point for her to shout, of course Naruto-sensei is good, he's going to be the next Hokage. In the heat of the moment she didn't even notice the man's eye widen in visible shock. He has a team. He muttered, face cast into an expression of surprise, only to shake himself out of it when faced with Ami's curious and suspicious look. I mean, Naruto Namikaze has a team? Even out here we get a lot of stories about that guy. From what I'd heard, he didn't seem the type. Ami's eyes stayed narrowed as she took a bite from her fish, only to grimace, it had gone cold. Right. Ami drawled before her curiosity overcame her. So what exactly do you hear about Naruto-sensei? At that the man gained an embarrassed grin. Oh, you know, the usual stuff for you shinobi types, daring deeds, amazing powers, fastest man alive, yada yada. He shrugged lackadaisically before leaning back against the cave wall, rubbing his stomach contentedly. Right, us shinobi types. Ami agreed slowly, finishing off her fish and placing it to the side. At least being a hermit seemed to do nothing to damper one's cooking skills. Anyway, I should be going. She shifted, finding that her various aches and pains wouldn't slow her down too much. He had done a good job on the bandaging. The man appeared to agree, nodding quickly as he lazily pushing himself to his feet. Right, your teammates are probably worried anyway. When Ami directed a pointed gaze at him, he simply grinned. You shinobi do go about in teams, right? She only maintained the narrowed gaze at him for a moment before a twinge in her side forced her to look away. As she walked away, he waved to her from beside the fire, the dancing light washing out his features for a moment as his visible eye seemed to flash red. But it was only for a moment, and Ami played it off as a trick of the light. See ya, kid, come back anytime, my cave's always open. There was a pause before the man began to laugh again. Get it? Because it doesn't have a door. The violet simply stifled a groan and strode on, suddenly feeling rather happy to be getting away from the strange hermit. However, even as she walked, tracing her way back to the river to get her bearings, she considered some of the oddities she had noticed. First of all, he was able to read her map. It was encoded in a way only shinobi should have been able to decipher it. Then he used both pronunciations of kunai. Civilians did not do that, not ones that she knew of. Finally, there was just something in the way he moved, with control and precision that non-shinobi just couldn't get naturally. However, the kicker came when she realized she had never even asked the man his name. That was unlike her. She had been trained to gather as much information as possible in any situation. Why had she ignored that training? She winced, blinking rapidly as she stumbled forward a step. She was trying to think back, to try and discern anything else she missed. However, even as she thought about it, it was becoming more and more difficult to even remember what the man had looked like. In a last bid, she turned on her heel and jogged back the way she came, or, at least, she thought it was the way she came. For some reason she couldn't find the cave again, but she had only taken a few steps out of it, right? In fact, what was she looking for again? She couldn't remember, at least, until the sound of water reached her ears. Right, the river. She had been looking for the river to find her bearings. She needed to get back to her teammates. Shaking her head of the weird fuzziness that seemed to be clouding her thoughts, she set a determined look on her features and ran off upstream. She winced as her injuries protested the movement, but she had done a good enough job bandaging herself up that she was confident she'd make it back to Konoha. The man watched silently from a nearby tree as Ami seemed to fight with herself before finally rushing off in the direction of the river. When she finally left his vision, he nodded to himself once before cracking his neck and dropping to the forest floor. She had been a good source of information, the type of person he imagined he would get on well with. It was a shame. She actually reminded him quite a bit of him. Damn tomato head, you were supposed to take care of things while I was gone, only to go and throw yourself into a war. He sighed, glancing up at the sky and scratching the back of his head before letting out a long exhale. I suppose it's time I stopped hiding, huh? He looked back to his cave and groaned, so much good food was going to go to waste. When I had just gotten good at being a hermit too. His groan quickly flipped to a grin so fast it was though some invisible switch had been pulled. Ah well, time to go see how much you guys screwed up the world without me. He chuckled as he adjusted his Ana mask so that his single cherry non-eye blazed steadily through the single eye hole, walking with silent footsteps out into the forest. Honestly, gotta do everything myself. Naruto stared at the full sake bottle sitting in front of him, just stared at it as he rested his head on one hand. The couch he was sitting on was his favorite as a child, sitting in his mother's lap as she tried to knit some abomination she called clothing or listening with rapt attention as his father would regale him with stories of shinobi, past and present. It didn't feel so comfortable now, not with the weight that seemed to have settled over his shoulders. The only reason he hadn't touched the bottle yet was because a large part of him refused to believe Ami was actually dead. You only drank to memories and Ami was no memory, not yet. Hell, Anko had been missing in action for months before they had found her. He wasn't one to give up so easily. That wouldn't make telling Anko or, heaven help him, Yojao any easier though. So when he heard footsteps he immediately swiveled in place, catching Anko off guard as she paused at the foot of the stairs, clad in nothing but an oversized shirt. Oh, hey Naruto, what was up with last night anyway? You dumped that girl off on me without warning then just run off. Naruto found his words catching in his throat as he watched her suddenly shake her head, an excited gleam entering her eyes. Anyway, that doesn't matter, you'll never guess what. She exclaimed brightly. Anko I. He struggled to find the words for a moment. Ami had been like a little sister to Anko. I need to tell you something, it's dash. However, he was suddenly cut off as Anko sprung forward, pressing a finger to his lips with a predatory grin. Me first. She grinned, taking a few swirling steps backwards. She seemed a whole lot bubblier than normal. Finally she composed herself before taking a deep breath and brightly exclaiming, I'm pregnant. And just like that, Naruto's entire world ground to an abrupt halt, his words dying on the tip of his tongue. Yuri. He just about managed, quickly earning a happy nod from Anko. In fact, he had never seen her quite so ecstatic. There really was no other word for it. She beamed brightly. He couldn't tell if it was from the news or if she was just enjoying the dumbfounded expression on his face. I'm going to be a father. That was the one, singular thought that was running around his head, as if on loop. However, when he finally voiced it he couldn't quite believe his own ears. Yep. Anko nodded helpfully again, her grin only stretching even further across her cheeks somehow. A dad. He managed again, quite eloquently as he would later recall. Anko agreed, seemingly losing amusement in his reaction at this point. It didn't seem to matter as much though when the gears in Naruto's head finally clicked together and meshed. His eyes brightened at the same moment he rushed forward, grabbing Anko around the waist, picking her up and suddenly spinning her around. We're going to be parents. The joy was practically palpable in his voice, all other thoughts suddenly vanishing from his mind. He was going to have a son, or daughter, or twins. The thought briefly made him gulp before his previous happiness washed over him again. Anko seemed just as excited as he was, grabbing him tightly and wrapping her legs around his waist as she pulled him in for a searing kiss. A million thoughts rushed through Naruto's mind as they just stood there, absorbed in each other's presence. However, when they finally separated, Naruto's eye caught a picture frame on a nearby table. It was of him as a young child, his arms draped around the neck of his parents as they hoisted him between them. Cold reality came crashing down on him in the wake of his euphoria. He was going to be a father, there would be a tiny, fragile little life that would depend on him and Anko completely. He was going to be bringing a life into the world, into this world. A world of war, and pain, and loss. Right at that moment, as his expression hardened and his eyes became icy with determination, he vowed to himself that he would always be there for his child, no matter what. Nothing would ever tear his family apart, nothing, not again. Anko seemed to sense his sudden shift, pulling back with a concerned frown. Is everything okay? Snapped back into the present by her shaking voice, he quickly realized how he might have worried her and smiled warmly. He pulled her closer and placed a gentle kiss on her forehead before wrapping her up and simply holding her against him for a long few seconds. Everything's fine, or at least, it will be. He pulled back away from her and began to move upstairs, Anko rushing after him. Where are you going? She called from the bottom of the stairs, causing the redhead to turn and look down at her from the landing. Don't worry, there's just something I have to go do real quick. He smiled disarmingly. I'll be back in time to share a drink. He paused, glancing down at her stomach quickly, to celebrate with you. With that he turned and swept into his office, causing Anko to pout as she moved herself back over to the couch and plopped herself down, arms crossed under her chest in a huff. When she saw him again it was in a bright red flash as he reappeared in the hallway, already making for the door. Where are you going now? She demanded from her place leaning over the back of the couch. He simply waved a hand at her, already striding out the door. Be right back, I'm going to go end a war before it starts. He shouted back in an indecipherable tone. Anko just huffed, before blinking as she remembered something. Hey, what was the thing you wanted to tell me? She called out too late as the door slammed shut. The scratch of a pen on paper broke the shallow silence of a small, hidden grove just south of the border between Kaminari and Shimo. A dark-skinned, bulk of a man dressed in a heavily modified version of the Kumogakuer uniform sat on a log to one side. His sunglasses-covered face was screwed up in concentration as he mused out loud, writing in a tiny notebook every so often. Yo, that's my flow, yeah no. He paused, finger against his chin as he stared at the page before frowning and quickly scratching it out. Nah man, that's amateur stuff, not worthy of the Killy RB. His ears perked up as someone else suddenly invaded his little sanctuary, a tall red-haired man he had never seen before but looked oddly familiar. What's up my man, you come with a plan? Are you here to see the one and only Killer Bee? Those autographs ain't free, yeah mean. The man stopped, an eyebrow quirking in what might have been amusement if his expression wasn't so otherwise serious. Sorry, not here for an autograph. It was then that the light caught the man's headband, tied around his bicep over the rolled-up sleeves of his Jonin uniform. You're Kirabi? The brother of the Yondaime Raikage. The man in question simply grinned as he launched himself to his feet, quickly pocketing the little notebook. The one and only, of the legendary A and B. The man simply observed the muscle-bound man for a few more moments before nodding to himself. All right. The next few things happened faster than most would have been able to follow, but it culminated in Naruto pressing his wind-infused Tonto up against two crossed swords practically buzzing with electricity as Kirabi held him back, muscles visibly straining from the sudden assault. Before Naruto knew what hit him he was sent flying back across the clearing, only to flip and land on his feet. He faintly saw something pink slip back behind Kirabi but wasn't sure what it was. Whoa man, you gotta chill out, I ain't sure what this is all about. In order to clear this fog we gotta start up a dialogue, Kirabi rapped quickly as Naruto shot toward him again, Tonto drawn and shimmering with vicious green energy. The man was visibly nervous as he dodged back from the initial swing, deflecting the next and ducked under the third. When he swung back up for a vicious uppercut Naruto simply flashed to the other side of the clearing. It had only taken Kirabi the initial burst of high-speed movement for him to recognize the bloody flash from the bingo book. Why's a guy like the big bad Flash, wanting to go all smash and crash, fool ya fool? He started up during the brief reprieve, only to have the redhead glare at him. I didn't start this, I'm just ending what your brother started before anyone else dies, unfortunately I need you to do that. We might have been friends under better circumstances. With that he flashed forward again, However, in the lull in combat he gave Kiribi time to collect himself and suddenly found the air around the man littered with swords, 7 in all. In obviously well-practiced and deceptively ridiculous movements, the Kumo Jinchuriki caught them all across various places in his body. It gave him the look of a metal porcupine with them all sticking out at odd angles. "Ah ma'am, waps big buo dun mo, I pay kasab apical and he goes en sparps a row." Kiribi grumbled through the sword held in his mouth. Naruto eyed him hesitantly for a few moments. The sword style may have looked laughable, but the way the man held himself spoke of countless hours in training. The number of blades alone made him cautious enough to sheath his tanto and instead bring out 2 of his kunai. Something told him he would need the extra maneuverability. Surprisingly, it was Kiribi who made the first move, launching himself forward right at the redhead with considerable speed, well above a normal jonin at least. There was a reason he was considered the second strongest man in Kumogakuer. That didn't matter though. If Naruto couldn't defeat him, then nothing he was doing right now would matter. So instead he dived right at him, kunai shrieking with energy and eyes darting about frantically at each of the swords, keeping track of them all in their high-speed frenzy. Kiribi was genuinely surprised at the first ever opponent to rush him, especially considering his veritable buzzsaw of a body. That moment of ever so slight hesitation cost him as Naruto suddenly appeared within his guard, somehow managing to parry 3 different blades at once with his 2 kunai. What looked like a fourth, although Kiribi knew that to be impossible, suddenly struck out at him. He leaned his head to the side and only received a light scratch along his cheek for the trouble, or he thought so until he heard something snap and his vision became considerably lighter. "My shades!" He lamented softly as his sunglasses fell to the ground in 2 pieces, his dark eyes narrowing instantly. "Yo ma'am, mo I piece personal." Anyone that knew him personally would have been surprised when he stopped rapping and understood just how serious he had become. His limbs suddenly came in as a blur of whirring blue light as his swords appeared to multiply right before Naruto's eyes. Suddenly the air around the 2 became a maelstrom of steel, lightning, and displaced air. There were no openings in the man's guard, and the sheer number of weapons he was able to bring to bear at dizzying angles actually managed to go a long way in neutralizing whatever advantage Naruto's superior speed and reflexes would have given him. It was stalemated for them. Naruto could block, parry, or divert all of the man's attacks but land none of his own. At this rate it was becoming a battle of attrition, and between the containers of the Hachibi and Cubit it was going to be a very, very long battle of attrition. Suddenly Naruto dived backwards to escape the melee of sharp steel, hands already cycling through seals. Wind release, shearing gale. As he exhaled, 5 long scythes of lethally sharp wind lanced out at Kiribi, forcing the man to bring around 5 of his blades to destroy them. But then, the plan was never for the jutsu to hit. The millisecond Naruto's feet touched solid ground, he was already pushing chakra through his toes. He rocketed forward in a blur of red, right on the tail of his own technique. His eyes tracked Kiribi's weapons, 5 of them locked down in defending against his technique. 1 of them was in the crook of his right knee, behind the man and useless. The last was suddenly knocked out from his mouth as Naruto flicked his wind-enhanced kunai at it, the prongs of the small blade catching the tsuba and wrenching it out from the Jinchuriki's teeth. Suddenly Kiribi found himself staring at the business end of Naruto's knee, in what was sure to be a move that would knock him out or at least disorient him, with no humane way to defend against it in time. Naturally Naruto's surprise was immense then as he suddenly found what looked to be an 8th sword interposed between Kiribi and himself. It forced him to bring around his kunai to prevent his head being cleanly separated from his shoulders. The 2 clashed, and in a contest of strength that, with his superior build and Naruto's lack of leverage in the air, Kiribi quickly won, flinging the redhead back across the clearing. "Man, Mr. 9, that move was too damn fine, ya fool!" Kiribi exclaimed energetically now that his mouth was free, the previous insult against his shades apparently forgotten in his excitement. Naruto quickly grasped why his plan had failed as he saw a long grayish-ink octopus tentacle holding a sword defensively in front of Kiribi, apparently the very same one he had knocked out of the man's mouth. It emerged from the man's back but quickly slithered back after replacing the displaced sword. "I see I goppa mock IP up a few pegs." The Kumo shinobi shouted, once again muffled by the hilt he was biting. However, Naruto didn't get to ponder the ludicrousness of the situation as a foul pressure began to invade the air. A familiar and noxious chakra began to bubble up from Kiribi's skin, finally enveloping the man in a sickly orange layer of surprisingly crisp and controlled Biju chakra. Four tails waved lazily behind him as he grinned through the sword in his teeth. "Let's see how you handle this," he growled in a mildly distorted voice before rocketing forward at alarming speeds, the ground cratering in his wake. Naruto's reflexes easily moved his body to the side. Kiribi was still slower than him, however the lance of pure energy was a bit harder to dodge and he was rewarded with a light burn across his arm. Despite being a Jinchuriki himself, Naruto had never had all that much exposure to his own Biju's chakra. That stuff would be just as dangerous to him as it would be to others, perhaps not toxic, but just as damaging. He had grown tired of engaging the Jinchuriki directly anyway, quickly throwing out a handful of kunai that rapidly multiplied into 50 with a few well-placed head seals. Before Kiribi knew what hit him, the tables had been turned yet again and he was swiftly assaulted by what looked to be an army of feet appearing out of red flashes that were gone before they were even fully visible. Even covered in Biju chakra, the sustained assault, with no way to block it, couldn't be endured for long. With a roar that shook the trees around them, Naruto was suddenly blasted back by a surge of particularly dense and foul chakra. In the center of it all stood Kiribi, swords gone only to be replaced by 8 blood-red appendages of pure energy. Instead of the semi-translucent coverage the four-tailed state had provided, Kiribi was now shrouded in an opaque red layer that looked more like blood than anything else. Naruto didn't get a lot of time to admire it though, as suddenly the chakra-shrouded beast was blasting towards him, creating a small shockwave from his speed. One arm was outstretched and in a blink a full ox skull imposed itself across the bicep, that was level with Naruto's neck. "Lariat!" was all Naruto heard as he bent his body back, allowing the charging arm to pass straight over him. He was glad he didn't attempt to halt the raging Jinchuriki, as it took around 4 trees to finally halt his momentum. He turned, revealing soulless white voids that seemed to ask for eyes and a mouth full of jagged, misaligned things that Naruto supposed were teeth. He sighed before cracking his neck, settling back into a loose, comfortable stance as he motioned at the transformed Kiribi with one hand. Mistake number 1, fighting a seal master as a mass of chakra. Kiribi seemed to grin at that, although it was hard to tell. With a grunt he lined up for another charge, what passed for muscles in his strange form tensing. With a growl he shot off again, this time even faster as the ox skull created velocity rings in its wake. Mistake number 2, Naruto called out as he span to the side at the last moment, allowing the charging beast to fly right by him unscathed. "Giving up the advantage your blades gave you." Kiribi snorted angrily at that, looking even more the picture of a bull facing a matador. He never even noticed Naruto's smirk as the Namikaze ushered him forward once again. And mistake number 3, Kiribi noticed the gleam in the redhead's eye when it was already too late and he was a few feet away, unable to halt his own momentum. Thinking this clone was actually me, boom. The explosion that followed rent the trees around the clearing back violently, sending smoke and ash high into the sky that could be seen for miles around. It was enough to say that Naruto had not held back on Kiribi's account. Marui was, for all intents and purposes, having a fairly boring day. Despite guarding one of Kumogakure's more entrenched camps, nothing was happening and likely wouldn't for a while. They were in the tundra of Shimo no Kuni, right on the border with Kaminari, where it was just far enough away to not be home, but certainly cold enough to feel like it. He watched the campfire flicker pathetically, not really holding up against the snowy winds all that well. For a second he could have sworn the fire turned red for just a moment but passed it off. Or at least, he did until he noticed the sudden silence that had descended over the camp. He looked up only to see a man standing right in the middle of the clearing, at his feet a very recognizable kunai. It wasn't just any man though, it was a man most would recognize as quickly climbing his way to a flea on sight order in the bingo books. Slung under his arm was a man all the Kumo shinobi would recognize even in the most bruised and bloody state, which was good because he wasn't far off from it. Naruto threw Kiribi down roughly, placing a foot on his back and his tanto dangerously close to the Hachiba Jinchuriki's neck, so much so that the fluctuating wind chakra actually sliced a paper-thin line into his skin. He glanced around at the assembled shinobi pointedly, as if summing them up with his gaze alone. "One of you go message your Raikage, tell him the Go-Daime Hokage wants to talk to him." Chapter 36, Familiar Duels. The tension in the air was palpable, nobody daring to make a noise above the slight crackle of the campfire. An attempt might have been made to rescue their captive comrade, but there was something about the quiet intensity with which Naruto stood there, blade never wavering from Killer Bee's neck, that stopped them in their tracks. Instead they all just waited there, silently, for the half hour it took for the messenger hawk to make it back to Kumogakuer. While the wait for the message to arrive was tortuously slow, the response was rather more abrupt. Naruto was the first to notice, suddenly taking a step back and dragging Killer Bee upright, still with the humming blade inches from the bigger man's neck. The Kumo shinobi acted predictably, each taking a step forward with their weapons drawn in anticipation of action. They needn't have bothered though, as a moment later a hulking mass, disguised poorly as a bolt of lightning, crashed into the clearing with the subtlety of the subtlety of the Raikage. Namikaze. Standing in a small crater of his own making, the enormous bull of a man that was the fourth Raikage glared at the much smaller and decidedly calmer Konohanain with all the murderous intent a man of his size could muster. That was to say, a lot. Raikage Dano, Naruto greeted with a small incline of his head, as if he wasn't holding the man's brother at sword point. The level greeting only seemed to infuriate the man further. He was only held in check by the mental maths of whether he thought himself fast enough to reach Naruto and cave in the redhead's skull before the smaller man could slit his brother's throat. Ai was a prideful man, but he wasn't, as some were led to believe by his brash tendencies, an idiot. He seemed to take a moment to forcefully rein his emotions in, locking them behind a stern facade all good leaders were forced to acquire at some point. When he was done, he was no longer humming with the restrained energy of his signature lightning armor and instead stood at his full, impressive height with his arms crossed. The only remaining sign of his displeasure was the slight throb of a vein on his forehead. Naruto hadn't moved an inch, almost reverting back to his days as an Umbu captain with the extreme control he exerted on his expression. The Raikage was truly an impressive man, no so much in his stature, although he was definitely the largest man Naruto had ever seen, but with his presence. Even Killer Bee, sheathed in the noxious chakra of his full 8 tails mode, did quite measure up. Naruto almost wanted to laugh at the fact that, against all odds, he didn't find himself in the least bit intimidated. Here he was standing in front of the man whose speed was even acknowledged by his father, and had only decades to become stronger, and he only found himself excited, giddy even. So, the man ground out through gritted teeth. "I heard you had something you wanted to talk about." Naruto nodded. "A proposition, if you would, to minimize casualties from this unnecessary war." "I'm listening," Ai said, although the glance down at his still unconscious brother added the unspoken, "because I have little choice. Me and you, one fight, right here." From the way the Raikage's eyebrow quirked, Naruto could tell he'd caught the man's interest. "I win." Kumo retreats back to their borders behind Shimo no Kuni, immediately, no question, no stalling. Any Konoha prisoners taken will be returned, unharmed, and a reconciliation payment will be made for each man killed since you started this invasion. Naruto had rehearsed the offer in his head 100 times while he was waiting for the man to show up. He had been expecting a number of outcomes: indignant cries, outrage, being laughed off as a lunatic. What he hadn't expected was the grin that suddenly overtook the Raikage's features. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "And if I were to take you up on this challenge, what would happen when I win?" Naruto could hear the careful wording there that boasted the man's confidence and had to bite down a snarky retort. Things Anko would say were not on the list of appropriate diplomatic responses, no matter how cathartic it might have been. Kumo would keep any territories they've claimed up until now. We would return all Kumo prisoners currently in our possession, including the same reconciliation payment for casualties I'm demanding. Already he could hear the phantom yells of the clan head in his ears for what he was saying. There would be hell to pay for this even if he won. And I would guarantee no retaliatory action from Konoha for 5 years. That was particularly painful to say and was sure to catch him a lot of flack when he got home. Hell, if he got home. After threatening the Raikage's brother, the man may not be in the most charitable mood. Obviously, the terms were at least enough to make the bulky man think about it, although Naruto was rather banking on the man's reputation of making executive decisions without a great deal of input from his advisors. It would mostly determine if he could pull off this lunacy he was loosely calling a plan. "On what authority are you making, or enforcing these terms?" The Raikage asked after a drawn-out period of reflection. That limprist Sarutobi doesn't seem the type to broker terms so clean-cut. Ignoring the slight to his leader, he had the feeling he'd have the chance to get his own back pretty soon. Naruto drew himself up to his full height, hoping he looked somewhat impressive. As Naruto Namikaze, Go Daime Hokage of Konohagakuer no Sato. There was another long moment as the full weight of his words sank into the clearing, including somewhat to Naruto himself. He knew what he said to the shinobi when he'd first gotten here, but this was the first time he really meant it. He was the Hokage. Or he would be, if he survived this stunt. And what's stopping me from reneging the moment you take that sword away from my idiot brother's neck? The Raikage asked in a surprisingly diplomatic tone, considering the fact that a moment ago he had looked ready to personally bulldoze the surrounding forest and dim the consequences. Well, I'm not going to bandy around words like honor, we're shinobi. Naruto shot back, feeling a little easier now that his claim seemed to have been accepted. But I've heard, at least, that you're a man who respects individual power. That's all I'm doing here, wagering my power against yours. Simple as that. AI just grunted, still looking vaguely amused. Some classic mano a mano stuff. He inhaled deeply, glancing around his assembled men, none of whom seemed like they had a clue what to do in this situation. It wasn't unprecedented in Kumo to have such challenges, although never with somebody from a different nation, or for stakes quite so high. I suppose I can get behind that. Although why should I accept? Even if I win, I could potentially get much more from this invasion if I press on. Your village is weak right now, stretched thin. A hard look entered the redhead's eye. Because Konoha, no matter how weakened, will burn you for every inch of land you take. He surprised everyone when the flow of chakra to his blade suddenly cut out, smoothly sheathing it in a fluid motion. And you're a Kage? He motioned for one of the Kumonin to take Killer Bee away and, after a hesitant look at his leader, the man complied. Which means you care about every soldier under your command. Naruto knew this was the critical juncture. In normal politics he had essentially committed suicide by throwing away his leverage. But this was shinobi politics, and he wasn't exactly talking to a normal diplomat. There was the tensest and longest pause yet before finally, and with a great deal of internal relief, the Raikage grinned. Deal. They had moved to a much more open space in the forest, closer to the border with Shimo so that a light dusting of snow covered the ground while hoarfrost crept up the trees. It might have been rather picturesque if Naruto wasn't about to go toe-to-toe with a man who could take his head off by flexing his bicep too hard. They stood at opposite ends of the field, surrounded by Kumonin in the trees, not to contain the fight, or even as insurance for Naruto running, they just didn't want to miss the spectacle. I fought your old man once, you know. AI started conversationally. Apparently, the prospect of a good fight had lightened his mood enough to ignore the fact Naruto had held his brother hostage. I know, I've read his journal. UNB, the lethal tag team. The Raikage seemed pleased with that as he shucked his white robe, looking rather like a boxer, grandstanding for the audience as he cracked his neck with an audible pop. Well, that's good, with you here I get to prove that I'm more than enough on my own. I hope you're as slippery as your old man. There was no warning, no signal to announce the match had begun. Once second, although second may have been stretching it, AI was in front of him, the next a crackling, lightning-coated fist was inches from Naruto's face. The resulting explosion as the clone detonated was tremendous, but when the smoke cleared the Raikage simply stood there grinning, not even singed. Or this will be over too quickly. His only answer was Naruto dropping down behind him, looking unworried by the man's tremendous speed. You done? I thought we were fighting. Before the Raikage could even answer, Naruto was right there in front of him, hands planted on the ground as he levered himself up into a vicious axe kick that snapped AI's head back. He wasn't done though, avoiding the bigger man's right hook by dropping to the ground and trying to sweep his feet out. The man's legs were like steel posts though and barely budged, forcing Naruto to flip back as the ground he had been occupying was cratered by AI's fist. They took a moment to collect themselves, each weighing the other up. Been a long time since somebody tried to take me on in taijutsu. Naruto smirked slightly. How often do I get the chance to really get into gear? Well kid, if all you have is speed, this is going to be a short trip to the ground for you. We'll see. And like that the two finished their internal strategies and vanished in twin flickers. For the shinobi in the trees it was like watching some kind of light show, with streaks of red and blue crashing into one another all across the clearing, sometimes appearing to be in two places at once. Most were just amazed that any one man could match the speed of their Kage, apparently without any kind of technique. From the perspective of the fighters though it was a very different story, and AI's grin as he easily batted away another of Naruto's blows proved why. In this contest of speed there was no question who was superior. Naruto was fast, prodigiously fast, in fact he may have even been faster than his father, but he was human, and no matter how hard he trained his body there were limits a human just couldn't surpass. With his lighting armor activated the Raikage had three distinct advantages: the augmentation provided by the technique, the protection it offered from Naruto's hits and the fact that it completely negated the man's own nervous system. His reflexes might as well have been instantaneous and it was taking every ounce of training, working himself to the bone to squeeze out another step, a faster reaction, for Naruto to keep up. It was a very good thing then that Naruto wasn't solely dependent on his body then. AI wore a victorious smirk as he brought his elbow down in a crushing blow that should have knocked the Namikaze silly, only to pass through a red flash where his opponent was supposed to be. He recovered too late to avoid the three clones, each holding a swirling orb, that caught him in place. An agonizing squeal rent the air as pure chakra ground against the protective Raiden cloak. The Raikage could easily shift the distribution of the armor to protect some areas more than others, it was the founding principle of the lariat. However, that left him wide open when the real Naruto suddenly appeared in front of him, riding off a high-ration tag he had placed on his own clone, and smashed him right in the face with a bright white orb 3 times the size of the others. Big Ball Rasengan. This time the technique drilled right through the lighting armor, catching the Raikage right in the cheek and immediately launching the giant of a man halfway across the clearing, his body digging a shallow trench on the ground. Naruto stayed light on his toes though, not really expecting the attack to put the bigger man down. He was proven right when AI staggered out of the trench, his lighting armor fluctuating around him before he shook his head to clear it. Immediately the crackling electricity snapped into place and the man stood as if he hadn't been hit at all, lightly working his jaw. Good hit, I'll have to remember that one. Clearly not good enough. Naruto shot back, not really surprised but still somewhat disappointed it couldn't be that easy. Well, I think I'm done going easy on you. Couldn't have said it better myself, kid. AI was really beginning to enjoy this fight. The still air was suddenly permeated with the dull thuds of kunai finding their places all across the field, kunai AI knew all too well. I was wondering if I'd ever see this technique again, I assure you. Like a bolt of lightning he crossed the distance between the two in an instant, already smirking as his eyes caught the kunai slip into the air next to him. Too much like his dim father. He was already expecting it when Naruto suddenly flashed away to a different marker, but he was still focused on the one flipping through the air next to him almost in slow motion. I learned from my past. He twisted his body in less time than it took most to blink, kicking the kunai so hard that it embedded hilt first into a nearby tree. When Naruto reappeared, Rasengan in hand, he was disoriented, not appearing where he expected and was barely prepared for the sudden elbow descending on him from above. Guillotine drop. Few of the watching shinobi could even follow what happened, amongst the various flashes of the speed monster's fight. For a second, as the dust settled, they thought their Raikage had won and were about to cheer. But when the smoke cleared it became obvious Naruto wasn't out for the count yet, although he was cradling his arm slightly, wincing at his own brashness. It had all happened in a fraction of a second as Naruto had realized his mistake, bring his Rasengan up to take the brunt of the devastating blow. He had underestimated the sheer impact of that much Raiden chakra focused into a single point, losing control of his technique and blasting both of them back as the chakra vortex destabilized. He had managed to roll to a somewhat graceful stop but there was a decided twinge in his elbow now from trying to take that attack head on. Clearly, he wasn't going to be winning any battles of strength here, time to start fighting with his head. AI on the other hand merely seemed disgruntled that his attack hadn't caved in the redhead's chest. Those are some reflexes. I try, Naruto acknowledged casually rolling his shoulder until it clicked. The moment he did he suddenly vanished, making the Raikage immediately tense, eyes restlessly searching the various kunai he could see to try and catch where his wily opponent would emerge next. Moments later Naruto appeared at the other end of the field, but it might as well have been right next to the Raikage for the time it took the man to close the distance between them. He was so expecting another sudden disappearance, eyes already scanning for the most likely exit point, that he was caught off guard when his lariat actually made contact with something. Not for long though, as the clone he'd struck quickly popped. However, this was like no clone AI had ever seen before. Instead of smoke, or even an explosion, there was a strange sucking noise. AI felt the pressure in his ears change ever so slightly, and that was all the warning he got before an invisible pulse of something suddenly blasted him back. He flipped in the air and landed on his feet, not much worse off, but the same couldn't be said for his lighting armor. All along his front, where he had been facing the clone, the crackling electricity was thinned to just a finger's width across his body. That was all he needed to know what had happened. A wind clone, smart. He growled, glancing around the clearing warily. Vacuum clone, actually, Naruto corrected, flashing to a branch. You might have been able to outrun wind and I didn't want to waste the trick. Well, consider it wasted, the Raikage said, the lighting armor quickly fixing itself, even thickening slightly in anticipation of any similar tricks. Naruto's only response was a cheeky smirk as four more of him suddenly flashed into being around the bulky man. That was all the warning he allowed the Raikage before the melee was back on. Suddenly Naruto was everywhere in AI's vision, putting his numbers to good use as he kept in close to the lighting-shrouded Kage. Kicks harmlessly bounced off the man's charged skin and Naruto was pretty sure he'd sooner break his fist than actually damage the man with a punch. But AI was so swarmed that he could barely keep up. Every time he'd come close to hitting the irritating redhead, he, or his clone, would simply flash to a nearby kunai and quickly rejoin the perfectly coordinated dance of arms and legs. Eventually AI grew tired of the dogpile, pausing at the center of the melee as he was battered on all sides by mostly ineffective kicks. With a roar of exertion, he suddenly amped up the voltage of his lightning armor, having it explode around him like a crackling blue bomb. The four clones were immediately destroyed, filling the air with the sudden gasp of compressed air as huge chunks were ripped out of the Raikage's technique. The real Naruto was sent careening back across the field, crashing roughly into a tree and spinning to an awkward stop on the ground. He picked himself up a moment later but was forced to clutch at his side. That had been a nasty hit and he was fairly certain something was bruised, if not broken. AI wasn't looking much better though, his armor fluctuating erratically around his body as it tried to compensate for the sudden influx of futon chakra. Naruto grinned when he saw this, suddenly dropping down into a three-point stance before the Raikage could recover and flashing forward. AI would have stopped his med charge if four of the nearby Hirishin kunai didn't suddenly reveal themselves as hunged clones. They jumped in and grabbed the man's arms and legs long enough for Naruto to deliver a firm palm strike to the larger man's chest. The clones were immediately destroyed, ripped apart by the enraged Raikage, but they had done their job and Naruto successfully jumped back, wincing as he felt something shift in his chest. That lightning armor of yours was really irritating, you know. The redhead held up a ram seal and the Raikage was forced to a stop mid-charge, much to the shock of the watching Kumonin. 5 Hirishin markers, 1 on his chest and 4 more on his wrists and ankles, suddenly unfurled from where Naruto had finally managed to touch him without the lightning armor getting in the way. Namikaze style, 5-point seal. It was a significantly less efficient form of the seal he had used on the resurrected Shodai Hokage, but he had shoved a lot more chakra into it. Even now the Raikage was struggling against his invisible bonds, the seals glowing warningly. Naruto only needed a moment though. He brought his palm up, the familiar shape of the Rasengan swirling to life above his hand. Before it was finished forming though, he placed his other hand on top, a look of intense concentration forming on his features as a horrific screech filled the air. Slowly, the rotating sphere of chakra turned white, 4-blade-like projection emerging from the sides like some ridiculous shuriken. The redhead's hand visibly shook under the sheer effort and focus the technique took. When it was finished, the completed Rasengan hummed at a pitch so high it was almost inaudible. Futon, Rasengan, he whispered, fearful that even speaking too loudly could interfere with the incredibly delicate balance of the all-too unstable technique. He had seen what happened when that occurred and it had nearly cost him an arm. By now the Raikage was beginning to strain the limits of his seal, but it was too late. In a flash Naruto was in front of him, suddenly releasing the dangerous technique with an apologetic smile. AI literally had less than a fraction of a second to pour everything he could into his lightning armor before Naruto vanished in a red flash, shortly followed by the rest of the world. All the watching shinobi saw was an enormous dome of white chakra, grinding and screeching away at the land like a compressed hurricane. Even Naruto, from his perch on a nearby tree, was in slight awe of his technique's devastation. He was loath to use it most of the time, 1, because of the time it took him to set up, and 2, because he wasn't quite sure if anything could survive it. It was a testament to the Raikage's strength that he felt cornered enough to be forced to use one of his trump cards. Hell, he had only recently learned how to use it without seriously injuring himself in the process. He wasn't sure if it would even be possible without the high ration to instantaneously get him to safety. It wasn't like he could throw the damn thing. It took a few moments for the swirling vortex to finally die down, a few more for the resulting dust to settle. Everyone watching was astonished by the size of the crater, a perfect bowl in the ground marked with concentric grooves. It was as though some cosmic drill had attempted to crack the world and given up halfway. Even more incredible though was the single figure, just barely managing a low crouch, right at the very center of the destruction. "Kami-man, what does it take to put you down?" Naruto asked, flashing onto the edge of the crater and looking down at the Raikage with genuine respect. AI had clearly seen better days. His pants were torn to shreds, one of his enormous bronze armguards looked like it had been mauled by a tiger and the other was missing entirely. Likewise, cuts and scratches littered the man's body, giving him the appearance of some macabre voodoo doll. However, he was still standing, if only barely, and just about clinging onto consciousness as he managed to level a glare at the redhead, legs trembling. More than some light breeze, kid." Naruto couldn't help but smile, tremendously impressed with the man's sheer willpower not to simply collapse where he stood. He worked his way down the crater carefully, wary for some kind of trick or deception. It was unnecessary. AI was truly on his last legs, and contrary to his taunt, a strong breeze may well have knocked the man over. Naruto was almost disappointed. The fight had really gotten his blood pumping and he likely had the broken ribs to show for it. When he finally reached the bigger man, although their eyes were level now thanks to the way AI was crouching, an unspoken conversation seemed to take place in a split second. Finally, Naruto nodded and raised his hand. "Good fight." AI barely managed an acknowledging grunt before Naruto flooded his fist with chakra and brought it round in a devastating right straight that had the Raikage out before he hit the ground. The dull thud of his body finally hitting the ground marked a long stretch of silence before a shadow fell over Naruto's form. When he looked up he saw the Kumo shinobi that had been watching crowding around the lip of the crater, clearly uncertain of what to do now. A foreign shinobi had just knocked out their leader, in what was essentially a duel for the fate of a war no less. What were you supposed to do in that situation? Naruto just sighed. Ultimately it wasn't his problem, but all the same he felt a little bad for putting them in such an uncomfortable position. They were sure to get a chewing out when they got back to Kumogakure, not that he was in for a smooth welcome home either. He straightened up, wincing as he felt something scrape uncomfortably in his side, no hiding it either, that was going to need medical attention. He suddenly flashed up behind the ring of Kumonin, surprising a few and getting them to draw their weapons out of instinct. He ignored the swords and kunai and instead motioned down to their unconscious leader. "When he wakes up tell him." He looked around at the slightly nervous faces and sighed, "Someone tell him that I expect him to honor the deal. If not, I'll be back for round 2. Somebody must have been feeling confident as from the back of the crowd somebody shouted, "Can I book my seat in advance?" Naruto grinned at the remark, reminded of something Enko would say, gave a small incline of his head and vanished in a flash of red. The only evidence that he was even there were the 3-pronged kunai whose ceiling tags were already beginning to burn away. Naruto grunted as Sakura tightened the bandages around his chest with perhaps a little more force than was strictly necessary. That was the sight Hiruzen walked into as he entered the small, sequestered hospital room reserved for such discreet examinations. "If you're here to chew me out, Hokage-sama, I'm afraid my dash." He winced as Sakura patted him on the side none too gently. "My cute little student already beat you to it." And rightly so. Sakura complained, the glare she had worn since Naruto had flashed into the hospital unannounced never leaving her face for a moment. "Really, you have 2 broken ribs, severe bruising along your spine, electrical burns of all things, not to mention the damage to the chakra pathways in your hands. And the worst part is you won't tell me what the hell did this to you. Hiruzen just smiled at the scene fondly, reminded of his own student's gruff bedside manner. If you could just give us a moment, Sakura-kun. The pink-haired Mednin looked between the two men and huffed irritably, quickly walking towards the door. That's Sakura-sensei to you, Hokage-sama. Yakushi Shishao made it official yesterday. Congratulations, the elderly Hokage replied congenially, only receiving an eye roll in response as the young Mednin stalked out. He chuckled lightly as he turned back to Naruto. My, she reminds me more and more of Tsunade with every passing day, and they've never even met. Should we say a prayer for perverts everywhere? Naruto offered, shifting experimentally. She might not have been happy with him, but he couldn't deny Sakura's skill. She had really come a long way from the fawning little girl he had tied to a training post years ago. Perhaps later, Hiruzen agreed, still with that congenial smile that quickly had a stifling silence fill the room. I know what you're going to say, Naruto said quietly, unable to fully meet the Hokage's eye. It was a reckless, dangerous, stupid, ill-thought-out plan that could have backfired spectacularly. I was listening to my emotions instead of my head, and I put hundreds of lives in danger. Hiruzen merely raised his eyebrow. Yes, you did all of those things. He sighed, walking across the room to sink gratefully into a plush chair. This was one of those days the man truly showed his age, looking for all the world like the elderly man he felt like, instead of the feared multiple war veteran. But the important question is, would you do it again? Their eyes met, and this time Naruto found the strength to keep his gaze level. He had once been told he had the kind of eyes that could look right through a man. Hiruzen had the kind of eyes that stripped everything away and laid you out bare, every minuscule detail out in the open. They were eyes that took steel to lie to, steel that Naruto, exhausted, emotionally spent, injured, just didn't have in him. Yes, I would. He wasn't expecting the smile. Good. Hiruzen's smile only grew when he saw the redhead's confusion. Naruto, how many lives do you think I weigh on a daily basis? How many decisions I make every day that could send good men and women to their deaths? What you did today, while brash, and I would have preferred you come to me beforehand, saved hundreds, if not thousands of potential lives. Just as a flicker of hope welled in the young man's eyes, Hiruzen quickly went about quashing it. I'm not saying it was the correct choice, or even a particularly good one. That's a dangerous opinion to have of yourself. He sighed, once again falling back in his chair. The point I'm trying to make, Naruto, is that as Hokage you will be forced to make a lot of difficult decisions. Kami knows I have. It's whether you can live with those decisions that will define the kind of leader you become. He stood, motioning to the door. Now come along, I still need to give you a proper dressing down for acting like a rebellious teenager. But first, we need to run damage control. I can see to it that this appears to have been an authorized mission. Nobody can know you acted ubiquitously on this. He groaned lightly. The paperwork, no, actually, you can handle the paperwork. His smile returned, vindictive this time. Consider it training, for your new job. Naruto winced at the implication, already dreading those stacks of paper he'd have to wade through to fix his brash actions. Hiruzen paused in the doorway, as if remembering something. But, I suppose this can wait until the morning. As I understand it, you have quite the cause for celebration. The redhead's eyebrow quirked. How did you know? Anko had only told him 3 hours ago. Damn if that didn't feel like days ago. The old Hokage simply tapped the side of his nose. An old man needs his secrets. He shooed the prospective Hokage away, allowing the redhead to go with his consent and earning a smile in return. And Naruto? He caught the younger man about to hop out the window. Congratulations. Naruto simply grinned. He didn't have to be told that. That's it for part 9. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.